webinar forum focusing on long COVID and its effects on our community, presented by HealthWorks, Georgia SEAL, Alive in Color, and the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Convention of Georgia. I am Dr. Ike E. Mack, President of Fellowship Missionary Baptist Convention, and I'm honored to represent the faith-based community as we collaborate and partner with our health entities in a time that we have been challenged greatly by COVID-19. I'm also indeed honored to present our moderator for this event, Dr. Derek J. Hurd, who serves as Medical Director for Phoebe Putnam Hospital since the year of 2019. He's a graduate of Albany State in 1995, also a graduate of Medical College of Georgia, 1999, and he's also a member of the 2018 Leadership Georgia class. He's married and has 3 children. He's a dedicated member of the Mount Zion Baptist Church of Albany, Georgia, pastored by Dr. Daniel Simmons, and he serves faithfully as a deacon of the Deacons Ministry. I would like to present to you at this time our moderator for our forum on focusing on long COVID and its effects in our community, Dr. Derek J. Hurd.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for having me, Dr. Mack. I want to thank you and the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Convention of Georgia, along with Georgia SEAL, for hosting this event tonight, because I think we're going to be able to have a great conversation about a problem that is still affecting us in this community. And again, I want to say good evening to everyone. Tonight, we're going to be discussing some very important topics. We're going to be discussing the role of action of faith leaders throughout the pandemic. We're going to be discussing building trust among our congregations. We're also going to discuss the impact of long COVID, both physically, spiritually, and financially. We're going to discuss the importance of communicating the correct information about the virus, because we know there's been a lot of misinformation that's been out there. And we're also going to discuss faith in the middle of the pandemic and moving forward. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my esteemed and accomplished colleagues for the panel this evening. First, we have Dr. Renee Haynes, MD, MPH. Dr. Haynes is a board-certified family medicine physician. She is a graduate of Duke University, where she received her bachelor's. Also Florida International University, where she received her master's. The Morehouse School of Medicine, where she got her doctorate degree and did her fellowship. And then the University of South Florida, where she completed her residency in family medicine. She has previously worked as a primary care physician for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and currently works as the District Health Director for North Central Health District. And at the North Central Health District, she is the medical director for over 14 clinics. Again, Dr. Renee Haynes. Also, we have Ms. Nidra Fortson, MSN, MBA, and AGPCN BC. Nidra is the Executive Director and Nurse Practitioner at the Samaritan Clinic in Albany, Georgia. She led the Regional Congressional Black Caucus Institute's COVID-19 Coalition for Education and Awareness Project, where she represented the work of the Samaritan Clinic along with 11 colleagues from across the country. Ms. Fortson also was sought out by Senators Raphael Warnock and Amy Klobuchar to discuss the challenges faced in the uninsured community. Senator Warnock presented one of her patient stories from the floor of the Senate. Her COVID-19 work and service to uninsured patients in the community resulted in a front page New York Times story. Ms. Fortson was recently selected for Leadership Albany class of 2023. She is married to Kiesel Fortson, and together they have 2 sons, Cole and Corey. Ms. Fortson? All righty. So again, good evening to everyone. To our audience, we want to make sure that we hear from you tonight. So as we're going through our discussions, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. because when we get to a certain point in the program, we're going to have an opportunity to be able to answer some of those questions. So we look forward for a robust conversation, and we look forward to your participation. So again, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. So let's get started by talking about some facts about COVID-19. We're going to start talking about how our faith communities have been dealing with this and the urgency of closing the vaccine gap. As of October 18, we have more than 21,000 people who are hospitalized with COVID-19 in the United States. Now that is down from, that's down about 13,000 hospitalizations since mid-August, according to the CDC. But again, that's still a high number, and it represents the fact that we are not out completely of the COVID pandemic. From late August to mid-October, the 7-day moving average of cases has decreased from 617,000 to 261,000. But in the last week, it was up to 265,000 again. On October 18th, there were 3,156 new hospitalizations for COVID-19. And that's 1.8 times less than the average of hospitalizations 2 months prior. But again, it was not zero. Here in Georgia, the Omicron subvariant BA.5 represents the vast majority of cases at 81.7%. But also, we also have Omicron subvariant BA.4.6, which represents 13.1% of cases. And as of a week ago, we had 3,622 cases here in Georgia, which was down 17%. Hospitalizations are down 12%, and thankfully, deaths are down 20%. That being said, the Omicron variant still spreads very easily, and more easily than the original SARS-CoV-2 virus and the Delta variant. The Omicron subvariant COVID-19 BA.5 has become one of the most dominant strains in the United States, and it is able to evade immunity from COVID infection and the original COVID vaccine. This Omicron variant is believed to be 105% more times more contagious than Delta variant, which is 50% more contagious than the original COVID-19 strain. An unvaccinated individual's risk of death from Omicron is 10 times higher than the risk of death for vaccinated people. And I need to say that one more time so that you hear me. An unvaccinated individual's risk of death from Omicron is 10 times higher than the risk of death for vaccinated people. And hospitalization rates among unvaccinated adults were 3.4 times as high as those among vaccinated adults. So if you're not vaccinated, you're at a higher risk of being hospitalized, and you're at a 10 times higher risk of dying from COVID. Now, we know that the vaccines and boosters, the new vaccines and boosters are working even on this new Omicron variant. The actual outcomes of 6,023,452 fully vaccinated people in Georgia as of October 19th, we've only had 676,000 breakthrough cases. Vaccinated people with the primary series only had 460,000 of those, or 68%. The vaccinated with primary series and a booster went down to 31%, or 215,000 cases. Only 18,642 hospitalizations for those who have been vaccinated, and only 4,635 deaths. That's 0.7% of the people who have been vaccinated in Georgia who have died, or it did not work for them. So we're going to go to our panel. My first question is going to be for Dr. Haynes. Dr. Haynes, as I stated earlier, you have previously served as the District Health Director for North Central Health District, and also served as a medical director for 14 clinics. I have a two-part question. First, what are the physical challenges associated with long COVID? And then the follow-up question is, what are the financial challenges that are associated with long COVID?
Thank you so much for asking, Dr. Hurd. So the physical challenges are wide and varied. Some of the more popular symptoms people are familiar with are the loss of taste, the loss of smell that can persist. A lot of folks are familiar with the brain fog that patients suffering with long COVID talk about, which is they're not as sharp as they used to be. The other thing that impacts sufferers of long COVID is shortness of breath. And this is particularly hard for those who suffer with asthma, which is a condition that's more prevalent in the African American community. So those who have asthma now have another complication, which is persistent shortness of breath. On top of that, there's tiredness or fatigue that interferes with daily life. So you have someone who wants to be productive, but they're exhausted. And they're exhausted not just for a day or two, they're exhausted for months at a time. Other things that aren't as popular that can occur with long COVID is it can actually affect the menstrual cycle from women. So it can change what they're used to in terms of their menstrual cycle. In terms of neurological symptoms, they can have headache. It can start to interfere with sleep, where folks aren't able to get enough sleep. And that's important because for people, sleep, that's the time where your immune system is able to build up and recharge and help you fight off infections. So these patients with long COVID aren't able to get adequate amount of sleep. Of course, you can have chest pain, which is painful. You can also have palpitations or rapid beating of the heart. So those who have long COVID, there's a long variety of symptoms that can occur. This can impact the patients in several ways, but I'll talk about two ways mainly. So for example, if you're suffering from chest pain repetitively and you're going to the ER just to make sure you're not having a heart attack each time, if you don't have really good insurance, or if you have decent insurance, that can lead to medical debt. And as you are aware, the African American community in the US tends to have less financial resources than other communities. And so this taps out on their financial resources. If they're lucky and they don't have one of the conditions that require them to seek out medical care, but let's say they, for example, have the fatigue where they're just easily exhausted, this impacts the person's ability to go to work. If you're tired all the time and you can't produce, it'll probably be very hard for that person to maintain a job or keep their job, be productive at their job, or even get promoted at their job. So there's multiple financial impacts that long COVID has on those who suffer with it.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. And I tell you, I have a patient who's going through something similar to that, where because COVID affected her muscles, she's in a great deal of pain every day and has been unable to work for the past year. So we don't usually think about that. You know, we think of the initial infection and the hospitalization and how that can impact us financially, but it can have long-term effects on our finances as well. So thank you for that.
I do want to add that it does count as a disability if someone is suffering from long COVID and it's impacting them in that manner, they can qualify for disability.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have another question for you, Dr. Haynes. Would you share with us what you're doing in the community to help in the fight against COVID-19? How are you addressing vaccine hesitancy? And how are you urging the community to protect themselves?
Okay, so I'll go ahead and talk about the vaccine hesitancy first. And one of the things that we're doing is we're not brushing off the concerns of different community members. A lot of times it might be easy for folks to say very popular sayings such as trust the science, follow the science, which for those who are already scientifically inclined, that's easy to do. But when you have communities that have been historically mistreated by the scientific community, it's hard to just say that and think that that's going to get them to take a leap of faith and take the vaccine. And so what we do is we answer the questions honestly. When someone says, is this going to protect me against the upcoming variants? If you tell them it'll protect them against all the upcoming variants and then they find out it doesn't, that further breaks down the trust there. And so what we do is when there's questions that the community has, we through the data and make sure we answer them as honestly as possible. And what we also do is we empower the gatekeepers of different communities. So a lot of pastors, council members, when they have questions, we make sure that we answer them and provide that information to them so that they can then serve as advocates for the vaccine. Because if I'm coming into a community with which I have no ties, it's harder for that community to trust me than if I'm able to answer the questions of someone who is a long-term resident and advocate for those communities. Then that person is able to serve as a better advocate than I am. And so that's one of the ways we're trying to address vaccine hesitancy in various communities. In terms of trying to make sure that the community is engaged and is able to trust us, one of the things that we do is we try to make sure that the community understands what happens if they don't protect themselves. And one of the statistics you shared, Dr. Hurd, is that if someone is vaccinated, even if they do tend to get symptoms, they're milder or they're not as severe. And a lot of the pushback we've gotten is when someone who has been vaccinated ends up getting COVID or ends up in the hospital, because then folks say, oh, look, they got the vaccine and they ended up in the hospital, and so the vaccine doesn't work. But what we have to continue to emphasize is, yes, they got the vaccine and they ended up in the hospital, but what is really good about the fact that they got the vaccine is that they got out of the hospital. They got out of the hospital on their own two legs or in a wheelchair. They got out of the hospital. And so that's one of the reasons why I feel that it's very important for our community to protect ourselves. One, because we have a lot of the symptoms where when COVID gets a hold of it, it really takes a toll, such as diabetes and hypertension. And so if we have a large amount of that and we don't vaccinate ourselves, we're basically leaving ourselves vulnerable for the worst of COVID-19.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for those words. And I tell you, one of the things that I will say to my patients when they ask about, well, the vaccine didn't work, see, that person got sick. And I tell them, listen, you put on your seatbelt when you get in your car. That doesn't mean you're not going to have a car accident, but wearing that seatbelt gives you a better chance of surviving the accident. And so that's the same thing with the COVID vaccine. We're not saying that it's going to absolutely stop you from getting COVID, but the numbers bear out. You have less hospitalizations and less deaths compared to those people who have not been vaccinated. So again, it is very important to get vaccinated. Thank you, Dr. Haynes, for that. Next, I want to pivot to Nurse Practitioner Fortson. Ms. Fortson, I understand that you are actively involved in promoting COVID-19 prevention practices and vaccinations as the Executive Director and Nurse Practitioner at the Samaritan Clinic in Albany, Georgia. Thank you for your good work. The pandemic has adversely affected minority communities. However, we know you have been working with the Regional Congressional Black Caucus's Institute for COVID-19 Coalition for Education and Awareness Project. Please share with the audience what you're seeing and hearing from these communities. Are there any challenges that you face in serving our communities, and how are you working to overcome those challenges?
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Hurd. I am delighted to be here this evening. The work that we have done here at Samaritan Clinic with the support of the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, the East Bay Community Foundation, and the Kaiser Family Foundation, we were able to lead an initiative across the Southwest Georgia region to include Columbus and I guess Middle Georgia and Macon. And we were able to share resources. We were able to talk about the similarities that we were facing in our communities. And we were able to agree that the work that we do is very important and we can't do it alone. So the one thing that was very prevalent across all of those communities was that we needed the faith-based community in order to make our work come to fruition and to do what we needed to do in the community. Without the help of my pastor, Daniel Simmons at Mount Zion, we couldn't have touched nearly the number of patients that we were able to touch to get information out. So one of the primary concerns with regard to the COVID project with those organizations was to dispel myths and misinformation And so we were out, we went to the patient. We didn't wait for the patient to come to us. We had to go and meet the patients where they were. That really was the difference, I think, in the work that we've done. And that we continue to do with the support, continued support of the East Bay Community Foundation. We, on our own accord, just because we are a caring organization, that's what we do. We reach the people where they are. And because of that, we went ahead and we started looking at ways to start gathering information. Now, there's very little research on long COVID, but what we do know is that African Americans have a much more difficult time even accessing care without COVID. Okay, so now that we have COVID and now we're talking about long COVID, you know, there are certainly issues that arise with those patients, and being able to access care continues to be an issue. And for us, that creates a real challenge in terms of resources. We have to have resources in order to do what we do. And again, it has to come from a place of care and concern. It can't come from a place of, well, I have to treat you because the regulations require me. You can't treat people that way. And so, you know, on our own accord, we developed a survey that looked at, you know, COVID and long COVID symptoms. And we asked people, what are you dealing with? You know, like what really happened? Are your family members, you know, did they have COVID, and are there long-term effects there? So that whole family unit really is affected. And so we're just starting to look at that data to see what is actually going on the ground, because not many people are willing to go to the on the ground level and look at what's really happening. So when 50 people tell me they're suffering from mental health, even though that's a small number to most, that matters to me. And I want to make sure those 50 people are connected to some form of help system with those issues.
No, I tell you, Ms. Forson, you are so correct. And I think our audience needs to understand that long COVID is going to be an evolving problem. This is something that we're going to be dealing with now for generations, decades, generations. And we're going to be seeing the effects of this for years to come. And so I encourage those of you who are on the webinar tonight to make sure that you're having these conversations in your families, that you're talking to your healthcare providers if you're having symptoms. You know, even if you think that it's strange, if you're just like, oh God, is this something that could be happening to me? You need to let your providers know, because this is going to be evolving science for us. And you may be instrumental in helping us learn about what some of those symptoms are going to be. And then to Ms. Forson's point also, that it's going to be more than just the physical that you're dealing with. It's going to be the emotional that you're going to be dealing with as well. We've seen rates of depression and anxiety go up since the pandemic has happened. And so again, getting treated and sharing those feelings are going to be vitally important, because as providers, we need to hear that information. We can't help if we don't know that you're going through it. So don't be afraid to mention those things. Now, Ms. Forson, another question I have for you tonight is, you're doing great work. Are there opportunities for those who are on the forum tonight to collaborate with you or use your services?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. One of the things that we have been really fortunate to have as a result of the work that we did in that COVID project is an invitation from the National Minority Equality Forum, where they have invited us to come and participate in beginning clinical trials, because one of the things that African Americans don't have is the advantage of being a part of clinical trials, where they're deciding what works for one group or not. So if we are doing clinical trials that is specific to the African American community, then that improves our chances of getting the treatments and getting the care that we need, just like any other group of persons. So yes, there is an opportunity for anybody to reach out to us. We are a ministry of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Albany, Georgia, and they can certainly call the number at Samaritan Clinic. I don't know if you want me to give that right now. But,
no, certainly, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Okay, that number is 229-887-5800. 888-7420, and we'd be delighted to speak with you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Something that you said there that I think is vitally important in our community is the lack of representation in clinical trials. And that's one of the things that we complained about when the pandemic started, was that, well, how can I trust the science because the science doesn't necessarily represent me? Well, we only get represented if we're going to be involved in clinical trials. So we have to step up and be a part of those trials. So working with your group such as yourself, Ms. Fortson, getting our information into data banks so that it can be used, because as we all know, our world is now more and more going to be based on big data. And big data means that if I'm having a symptom, you say that a 50-year-old Black male had this, and that when they got infected with COVID in 2021. That goes into a database. And so then that database can then be transferred. And so people around the world can see that information and then use that as part of a trial that they're doing. And so, again, for those of you that are on the forum tonight, if you have the opportunity, if you feel convicted, please make sure that you contact Ms. Fortson or other entities like Morehouse School of Medicine or Dr. Haynes and her group to get involved with different sorts of research projects, because it's going to be vital for our community going forward. Other communities are represented all the time, but it's now time for our community to start getting that same representation. Do we have any questions in our chat tonight? I know you all are a little bit shy. We've been having a lot of good information coming out. So if you have any questions, don't be afraid to put them in the chat box, okay? All righty. Oh, we have a question. Do vaccination rates increase when you involve faith-based communities? All right. Dr. Haynes, do you want to address that?
Absolutely. Yes, vaccination rates do increase, and I can give you an example of that local here to Georgia. If some of you remember when COVID first hit, Hancock County got hit pretty hard. Hancock County is a majority African-American community. We went to that community, and one of the things that was the initial thoughts of providers was maybe transportation and getting to where we're giving vaccines was a hindrance. Let's go out to the communities. So we went and we got mobile units. And so we're out there with the mobile units. We're going to different communities, but people were still very hesitant. They were very hesitant because we were an outside entity coming into their community and trying to make a initial introduction and then get them to get the vaccination. So then we tried a second tactic, which was to work with the faith leaders in Hancock County. We did training with multiple churches there, multiple pastors, and that's when we started to see the vaccination rates increase. So I would say from my experience in Middle Georgia, I have definitely seen the power of faith leaders to get their congregations to take that leap of faith, literally.
For Ms. Fortson, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. So much of what we did depended upon our faith community leaders, and the vaccination events that were held at the church. Those are places that people trust, people know the pastor, people know the work of Mount Zion, and so they come out. So some of the largest vaccination events that were had in our community, which was also very hard hit, and actually number 3 in the world in terms of per capita COVID infection and death rates, we were able to successfully get a number of people out to get vaccinations. Is there still hesitancy? Absolutely. But one of the things that we pride ourselves in doing is talking with patients. We're not in a hurry to get you out in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. We just want to know, what is it? What kind of questions do you have? How can we get you past this point of not wanting to get this vaccine? So we did a lot of one-on-one And we thought that that was much more impactful on a smaller level, but the vaccine events done by the faith-based community we couldn't have done our work without that.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. We have another question. What is the current status of monoclonal antibody treatment and its effectiveness on the current variant? Dr. Haynes?
So that's an excellent question. And it's one where I'm going to be honest, even though I'd like to say slightly different things. So the monoclonal antibodies that were developed were really good against the initial strains of COVID that we have had. With the Omicron variant, there's reduced susceptibility of that variant to the monoclonal antibodies. And so one of the reasons why we initially pushed so strongly for vaccination amongst the community was we were trying to avoid the virus mutating, which that has occurred. That horse is out of the gate. And so the short answer is they're not effective as they were at the initial part of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are still one of the tools in our toolbox, but one of the reasons why COVID-19 is such a concern and was able to cause a pandemic is its rate of mutation and the ability of those mutations to basically escape the treatments that we have at hand. So the short answer is it's not as effective as it was against the original strains.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Haynes, I have another question for you. Can you please share your insights on the latest myths and your expertise on COVID-19 and vaccinations? And then a follow-up question to that would be, what opportunities exist for those accessing this forum to use your services?
So some of the latest and myths, and I say myth, is not as rampant as the some of the more I don't want to say outrageous, but like when folks were initially being told to utilize bleach and things of that nature. It's not that level, but what I would say is one of the myths now is that, you know, it's the same as flu. You know, why all the hoopla? And I would say that's one of the dangerous myths because it's so easily accepted. And so what I would say is that flu is a virus you have to respect. And I would encourage everyone to get your flu shot. But we haven't had long flu symptoms. There's been no seminar or webinar about that. We have that with COVID. And COVID is something that needs to be respected because it's a killer. And so I would say that's one of the myths that, you know, COVID is the same as flu. The other myths that are out there is that the scientists don't know what they're doing. Why do they keep having to release booster upon booster if they knew what they were doing the first time around? It hurts me a little bit as a scientist to say it, but I feel like in order to be an effective scientist, you have to acknowledge the concerns that the community has. And that's one of them, that why do I have to keep going and getting continual shots if you guys knew what you were doing the first time around? So what I would say is that science evolves the same way that the virus is evolving. Science has to evolve if it wants to be able to combat it. And so the myth that we have to adjust or we don't know what we're doing because now we have to go back to the lab and produce something else, that's what it is. It's a myth. Science is evolving, and if the virus is evolving, you have to be fair and expect for the scientists have to go back to the drawing board and to come up with something to combat the new variant. So I'll say that for the myths. There's plenty I can do, but I think those are some of the more egregious ones because they have so many believers. You know, I'll say those. in terms of my expertise on COVID-19 and vaccination, what I'll say is this: there are folks who trust kind of the tried and true vaccinations. So they trust shingles. They'll go out there and get their shingles. They'll go out there and get their flu shot, but they're hesitant to get a COVID vaccination because of how quickly it was developed. And so another myth is that because the vaccination was able to be produced so quickly, that it's more dangerous than the other vaccinations. So that's one of the ones that's out there. But what folks don't realize is it looks quickly to those outside of the medical community, but this was years in the making to develop that technology. And the scientist who developed it, she was kind enough not to patent it so that others could utilize it. And so you have that capacity there. The ability to do it quickly was also because of collaboration.
Yes.
You had scientists coming together with a shared goal. And a lot of times what slows things down is folks wanting to get all the credit, to be able. And so that's one of the things that slows us down repetitively. And so that's one of the things, if we could get the community to understand that you can trust it. It seems fast to you, but it took years in the making. And I'll say this, and I hope younger participants don't get upset, but I feel like if Apple is pushing something out that they quickly developed, folks are there wearing the short AirPods. My sister wears it, and they're not wondering, can I trust this? Apple developed this really quickly. When we generate new phone after new phone, folks just understand that that's part of technology and development. And I wish people would take that attribute and also be understanding that science is also continually evolving and developing new techniques. Opportunities for those accessing this forum to use your services. So what I'll do a short plug for the health departments, because a lot of times folks think of the health department for two reasons: shots and STDs. I'm going to be, this forum is making me have to hurt my feelings on all fronts as a scientist and also as a health department advocate. But what folks don't realize is that the health department has really highly trained nurses, especially here in Georgia, and they're able to assist. And what folks don't understand is that you can go in and you can see a nurse practitioner, and that nurse practitioner can help you discover what is going on with you at an affordable rate. And so in many of our health departments, we have a nurse practitioner on site that is able to provide those services to the community. And the other plug that I'll say is that with the health department, our main goal is to provide the service. So a lot of times when you go into private practice, before you even get to go back and see the doctor, you need to do a copay. But with the health department, our main goal and mission is for our community to be healthy. And so what I would tell folks is, please come and see the services that your local health department has. Use us. We're there for you, literally. And so I would say there's opportunities there if you have a young child that you want to get vaccinated, whether it's COVID or not, but we also do physicals if you need physicals for school. We do, in certain health departments, travel clinics if you're about to go somewhere out of the country. So there's plenty of opportunities, and we also partner. So if a church or a faith organization wants to have a COVID-19 vaccination drive, just reach out to your local health department and we'll try our best to see if we can't link with you or link with you with one of our third-party vendors that does a lot of vaccination in the area.
Well, thank you for all that great information, Dr. Haynes. Thank you. Nurse Practitioner Fortson, I have another question for you. Moving forward, how can faith-based institutions provide greater assistance to our community?
That's a really important question because a lot of times we get comfortable in where we are. We stop doing the things that help us to protect ourselves. We, don't talk about COVID as much. But I would just encourage all faith-based leaders to continue to keep the conversation top of mind. Just because it's not in the media, it's not being talked about regularly like it used to, that's an opportunity for them to continue to lead because COVID is not going away anytime soon. It's still here. You heard the numbers. And so I would just encourage our leaders to stay on top of that and follow closely with what's happening. The conversation that you just talked about, Dr. Haynes, in terms of scientists and their need to, evolve around the science and the technology and all of that, somebody at the community level has to be reverberating that information. I mean, like you can't just say it and know it. The community has to know that. And so how does that information get into the hands of people who, need to know, or they're hesitant of getting a vaccine? So, that I think is really important and important work that the faith-based community can certainly help us with.
Thank you for that, Ms. Fortson. And again, to reiterate, we know that the church is a safe place for our community. We trust the information that's coming from there. And so as a faith-based community, it is incumbent upon us to be able to go out and share this information with those people, because again, they may not trust it coming from other sources, because there are other sources out there that are not going to be reputable. And so having this information come from the church is extremely vital. So thank you for that. All right, I'm going to go to the chat box real quick, and we're going to take some more questions from the chat. The first question, Ms. Sylvia Woodford asked, is there a way to distinguish long COVID symptoms clinically from other respiratory illnesses, in particular flu, influenza? And that's open to either one of you to answer. Dr. Haynes?
Okay, so it's an excellent question. It's an excellent question because it's slightly complex. And let me explain why. So the symptoms themselves, there's not anything where I can say, it's long COVID, because when you cough at the end, you're going to go, there's nothing like that that'll distinguish the symptom for long COVID from flu or another respiratory condition. There's not that. What we have at our disposal is, let's say a client or patient comes in and they're having respiratory symptoms. We can go ahead and test for influenza. And let's say the test for influenza comes back positive. Then if that person goes ahead and sees improvement in their symptoms, then we can say, okay, it most likely was flu, because we do have a positive flu test there. But where we have to be careful is sometimes you can be co-infected. But let's say the person has flu, the symptoms are gone within 4 weeks, then we can with confidence say it was not long COVID, because in order for someone to be diagnosed with long COVID, usually they have to be 4 weeks out. But let's say the person has long COVID and is having these shortness of breath symptoms, then they're going to be hard to distinguish, because like I said, they're not easily distinguishable symptoms. But what I want to say on top of that is that you can also have folks with long COVID who had a negative COVID test. You can also have folks with long COVID who, when they had COVID, were asymptomatic. And that really complicates it, because what's dangerous is when you start to have folks who had mild COVID getting long COVID, because then the amount of the population that has had mild COVID who are now susceptible to long COVID, you're having a greater amount of the population impacted. And so the short answer to Ms. Woodford is the actual symptoms themselves are going to be extremely similar. You won't be able to just tell from the clinical symptoms. What will reveal itself is the length of time that the patient suffers with the symptoms. And I'll let Nurse Forston add to that if she so desires.
I just want to say, kind of in this season of, season change and all of that, people are getting sick. People may have a cold, you may have sinus issues, you may have the flu, or you may have COVID. You don't know, and we don't know. So what I would encourage people to do is, if you are sick and you have some place to go, make sure you have on a mask, wear your mask, or don't go, because you still have to protect the community. And so you can't just kind of be out there not knowing what's going on. So that's what I would encourage people, is continue to do all of the preventative things that we used to do when we were in the throes of COVID. The first time, washing your hands, wearing your mask when you're inside, or, if somebody is sick, make sure you're covering your mouth and nose with the mask. Just doing all of those preventative things that we all know so well. So that's what I would add.
And listen, I wasn't going to add anything to that, but you just brought up something that I really got to touch on. Listen, everyone, we are going to a lot of mask optional places now. Whether that's in our church homes, whether that's restaurants, things of that nature. If you are having any symptoms of being ill, a cough, a sniffle, anything, be kind to your neighbor. The Bible tells that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So be kind to your neighbor. If you have to go, put on a mask. But if you don't have to go, don't go. Because as Ms. Fortson said, we don't know if it's your sinuses. We don't know if it's the flu, if it's a common cold, or could it be COVID until you are tested. So if you have not been tested and you're having symptoms, don't go, or please wear a mask. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in there because that is one of the things that has been on my mind. Yes, Dr. Haynes.
I did want to add to that also the 6 feet. If you know you aren't feeling well, give others space. Let them know, when they come in for the hug, say, not today. And I know we're a very affectionate community, but we have to be responsible for keeping one another healthy. We are our brother's keeper. So if you know you're not feeling well, keep that 6 feet of distance as a way of trying to help others stay safe and healthy. So I just wanted to add that as well, because I do know a lot of times folks kind of start, and I think in our culture, the amount of space usually is not 6 feet. I think that's kind of our default, to get in a shorter space from one another. But go ahead and keep that distance and let them know, hey, I'm not feeling too hot. I want to make sure I'm keeping the 6 feet.
Okay, Dr. Haynes, there's a kind of an offshoot question to that statement that you just had. This Brenda Whitby says, can COVID be transmitted through by simply walking past someone, or do you have to spend a certain amount of time in contact with someone for it to be transmitted?
So this is what I say. Technically, things are possible, but the likelihood of it is extremely minimal if you're not spending, a certain amount of time. So if you're just walking by someone takes less than 5 minutes. So technically, when we were doing contact tracing, and someone had spent less than 5 minutes in the space of someone else, they were not considered a contact due to the very low likelihood of the virus being able to take hold in that very short duration of time. So what I would say is, if you walk by someone and they decide to cough right as you're passing by, most of the time you're safe, even if you don't have your mask on, but we still encourage your mask. But the likelihood of transmission, if you're just passing by, if you're on an elevator, that's a very short ride, even if they're coughing up a storm, if you're not there for more than 5 minutes, the likelihood is extremely minimal.
Thank you. Another question, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. Another question we have is from Ms. Adrienne Price. For those who have long COVID and have become disabled, as a result, should they first consult their physician in seeking disability, or do they go straight to Social Security Administration?
So,
And that's what
so what I'm used to doing is when a patient has symptoms like that, usually they'll see their physician, because if it's a medical cause of disability, usually they have to see a provider, whether it's their physician or their nurse practitioner. Usually they have to see a clinician in order for the clinician to rule out other possible causes that might be leading to that. And once that clinician is able to say, I suspect you most likely have long COVID, then usually at that point, they're able to have that in their medical record. And usually, to my knowledge, that is something that the disability office wants the patient to have prior to them starting the processing of that disability claim.
I will concur. I just want to concur with what she said. I've heard that some people are having some difficulties with getting disability as a result of COVID. So you have to go and get that diagnosis and have that in your medical record, as Dr. Haynes has said. But don't give up. That's the thing. Social Security is, they're notorious for, making you wait and all of that, but just don't give up. Keep going forward, and eventually things will work out for you.
Okay, another question. This is from Brenda Goolsby. How do you differentiate between RSV symptoms and COVID in children? Oh, these are some great questions.
I don't want to be a hog, so I don't know are you okay with kind of the pattern we've been doing, Nurse Forson, or would you like to go? Okay. Because I don't want to be like, well, Dr. Haynes just gobbled up all the questions and only left crumbs for me. But what I would say is, so that's a really excellent question, because one of the things that we're seeing this year is there's a lot of RSV amongst children in daycares and in other settings. So RSV is already starting to get a foothold. And for folks who are interested, it's respiratory syncytial virus. And so that's what the little kids are having to fight. Now, you can test, but it's kind of the same situation as with flu and COVID in the adult. Because the R in it indicates respiratory, and respiratory is one of the common symptoms in COVID symptoms. And so it is hard, but you can test. But like I said, you do have a minority of patients that they can end up still getting long COVID, even if they test negative. And so what I would say is this is one of the reasons why I do recommend folks come into their clinician instead of doing Dr. Google, is because the clinician is then going to get information from the individual that will help them narrow down which one it most likely is. So let's say we have a young patient and they're in class and 2 or 3 of their colleagues had RSV. Then usually that would be the top suspect. We'll test. But if that comes back negative and the child, we can test for COVID as well. So what I would say is it's similar to the adult situation, but for individuals, I would recommend that they go to the clinician, because the clinician a lot of times will be able to tease out which one is most likely based on the presenting symptoms, the length of the symptoms, and the information that the parents and child are able to provide.
Thank you. Another question. This one is from Miss Annie King. What is your recommendation on getting the flu shot and the COVID shot at the same time? I got both at the same time, and 3 weeks later, I had the flu. This is a great question. Thank you, Miss King, for sending that in. We're gonna love answering this one. So, Miss Forson, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Dr. Haynes?
Yes, no, I was going to say exactly what you said. There is no contraindication of getting both at the same time. Just don't be sick when you go and get either of them. So, but yes, it is possible.
And one thing I would just add to that is that, Ms. King, you said I got both at the same time, and 3 weeks later I had the flu. Here's what happened. And unfortunately, you waited a little bit too long to get your flu shot. What people don't realize is that you don't get immediate immunization once you get the shot. So you get the shot on Tuesday, and then you think that you're going to be immunized. It doesn't work like that. It usually takes anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks for you to get full immunity from the virus that you've been inoculated against. So you just happen to fall into that time space where your body had not built up enough immunity to be able to fight off the flu. And so unfortunately, you caught the flu. Now, guess what? Because you had gotten the flu vaccine, you probably had a much lighter course than you would have had if you had not gotten it, because you probably would have been a lot sicker. So that's why we encourage everyone to make sure you start getting your flu vaccines early on in the season. I try to get my patients as soon as they start offering them in late August, beginning of September. Go ahead, get signed up and get your vaccine, because as we see this year in Georgia, the cases start ramping up very quickly. And so we're now, and Dr. Haynes can probably speak to this, the state of Georgia, if you look on a heat box, is red hot, which means we have a lot of flu circulating. So if you have not gotten your flu shot by now, please go get it, because the time is now.
I absolutely agree, Dr. Hurd, because flu started early.
Yes.
Early this year. And I'll tell you, because we vaccinate in our office. And so we actually ended up vaccinating 2 weeks ago today, exactly, our district office. And I was kind of sitting on the edge of my seat because this is what I'll say. When you've had flu without any kind of vaccine, I mean, flu when it's beating you down, which I have had.
Yes.
Then after that, you tend to be eager to get your flu shot. You're looking to see how quickly you can get. And one of the reasons why I would encourage folks to get that vaccine as soon as you can is because flu isn't on our schedule. When it's ready to go ahead and rampage a community, it's out there hopping around. And even in the North Central Health District, we had folks who were having to call out with flu super early before we even started our flu campaigns. And so one of the things that I'll say is be proactive. Be proactive. And if you end up getting flu afterwards, still get your flu shot the next year, but maybe just like Dr. Hurd mentioned, get a little bit earlier.
Yes. And I think we have time for one more question. And this is coming from Miss Linda. It says, is it necessary to have a fourth vaccination if you've had the first 2 vaccinations and a booster for seniors over 65? Ms. Forson?
Now I'm going to give that one to Dr. Haynes.
All right, Dr. Haynes.
So I'll be happy to address this one. So is it necessary? I've always been told only 2 things are necessary, which is to pay your taxes and die. So those are the 2 things that are necessary. Is it beneficial? Definitely. And let me talk to why it's beneficial. So the first 2 vaccinations that we had, unless it was J&J, and if you had J&J, that's a whole nother topic thread in terms of efficiency, but let's stick to Pfizer and Moderna, which is what probably most of us got. So the first 2 vaccinations that you get, you might as well go ahead and think of that as one, because you needed both of those shots in order to initially be considered to be fully vaccinated. So those first 2 shots, that's really what you need in terms of the series to consider to be vaccination. Then we had a booster for folks over 65, but that booster was what we call monovalent, which means it basically was very limited in its efficiency. So we had it, we disseminated it. A lot of folks over 65 went ahead and got that. So that's your 3 that you're probably, saying, hey, I've been a good person. I've gone out and gotten my 3. But the ACIP, which is who analyzes the immunizations, have now said that don't even bother giving anyone who comes the monovalent booster anymore. It's not significant enough against the current variants where we would consider that a booster. Currently, the only booster that we're permitted to give is the bivalent, which is the 4th vaccination that this person is concerned about getting. The bivalent I would get, and I have gotten. So I'm not telling folks to go out and do something I haven't done. And I'll be honest, the bivalent, I said, well, let me look into this and see. And so I did look into it, and I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and get the bivalent. So the short answer is, if you want to be able to go out in a world where there's variants of COVID out there seeking to evade the immunity that you already had, I would highly recommend that you get the bivalent booster. And I would highly recommend that you get it because these variants are more dangerous than the original strain. And I'm just going to take a small little segment into science for a reason. So let me explain how the viruses go about. So you have the original strains of COVID out there, but the variants are able to take hold because they're badder. They're badder than the original strain, and they're more infectious. That's how they're able to beat out the other strains that were circulating in the community. And so my recommendation, Ms. Linda, is you may not like vaccinations, but for your health, it would probably be a very positive thing to do.
Thank you for that, Dr. Haynes. Thank you so much. In the few short minutes that we have left, I just want to let everyone know that we want to empower our community with the information that we produce tonight. Our panelists have done a wonderful job sharing their experiences and giving you information, but this does nothing if we don't take it back to our community and disseminate it and make sure that everyone else has been fed like you all have been fed tonight. So again, I thank you all for your time coming out and spending this opportunity with us. I want to give each of our panelists and Dr. Mack about 20 seconds for closing remarks. We'll start with Ms. Forson.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Haynes, for all of that wonderful, wonderful information. That's the kind of information the community needs. So those are things that we can take forward, teach our patients as we're learning still about COVID and these vaccines. So thank you all again for this opportunity. Let's keep our foot on the pedal and keep talking about COVID and understanding all of, how it is evolving and how it impacts our communities, because ultimately we're all responsible. And we're responsible for our communities. And so the more that we take time to take care of ourselves and take care of each other, when it comes to COVID, the better off we'll be as a community. So thank you all again for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Ms. Forson. Dr. Haynes?
I'm going to do a short plug just because the church is such an essential part of our community. I would like to encourage the different faith leaders who are a part of this panel to continue to have virtual options for others to attend, because there's a lot of folks who, if there's not a virtual option for the church, they're going to go in person, even if they're immunocompromised, even if they're not feeling well. And so one of the things I have to say that I take my hats off to the faith community is how quickly they were able to incorporate virtual options for those who were homebound, who were suffering with COVID, but needed to be uplifted in prayer. So I would like for folks to keep that in mind as you're seeing a lot of other segments of society running forward to be completely in person. I want to thank you all for letting me participate in this panel. I really enjoyed our moderator, Dr. Hurd, Pastor Mack, thanks for the opportunity, and our co-panelists, Nurse Forston, you've been a wealth of knowledge as well, and I've been very excited. I've only had positive interactions with Samaritan Clinic. There was one in Atlanta where I would volunteer when I was a student at Morehouse School of Medicine. So thank you for doing the work that you all do. That's all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes. And then Dr. Mack, closing thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Hurd. You are an extremely wonderful moderator. COVID is real, but tonight, our viewers have had a real panelist. You all have given us the bare truth. You've kept it so helpful, so beneficial that we can't help but now realize COVID is not gone. We must stay abreast of where we are and continue to follow some of the things that will help us sustain ourselves during this time. So I would like to take this moment at this time to thank Dr. Haynes, Ms. Forson, and certainly Dr. Hurd on behalf of Fellowship Missionary Baptist Convention, Georgia Seal, and HealthWorks for giving us a real seminar, webinar, and yes, forum on the effects of long COVID in our community. Thank you, and to our viewers, thank you as well.
All righty, good night, everyone. We thank you for joining us. Have a safe evening. God bless.